The day I buried my husband felt unreal, like I was walking through someone else's life while mine hovered somewhere far above, watching in silence. The sky was too clear for a day like that. A soft pale blue stretched endlessly above us, as if the world had decided to move on without acknowledging what had been taken from me. People often say time stops when tragedy hits, but that wasn't true. Time moved forward, cruelly steady, dragging me along whether I was ready or not. I stood beside the casket, my fingers gripping the edge so tightly they had gone numb. I barely noticed. The polished wood reflected distorted fragments of the people gathered around me, faces blurred by tears, whispers, and quiet condolences that blended into a distant hum. Every now and then, someone would step forward, touch my shoulder, and say something soft, something meant to comfort. I nodded each time, murmuring polite thanks, even though the words never truly reached me. All I could focus on was him. The stillness of it all was unbearable. He had never been still. Even in his quiet moments, there was always a warmth about him, a sense of life that filled every room he entered. Now there was nothing, just silence, just the unbearable finality of it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe as memories pressed in from all sides. The way he used to laugh, head tilted back without restraint. The way he'd squeeze my hand absent-mindedly when we walked together, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The way he always knew when I was upset, even when I tried to hide it. Those small, ordinary things felt heavier than anything else in that moment. Because they were gone. I glanced at the entrance again. It was instinct more than anything, a reflex I couldn't seem to control. Part of me still expected to see them walk in, my mother adjusting her shawl, my father scanning the room with that familiar critical gaze. They would arrive late, maybe, but they would come. They had to. But the doors remained closed. Each passing minute made the truth harder to ignore. They weren't coming. Not now. Not at all. My chest tightened, not just with grief but with something sharper, something that cut deeper because it didn't belong in a moment like this. Disappointment didn't even begin to cover it. It was something colder. Something heavier. A quiet kind of betrayal. The phone call from that morning echoed in my mind, clearer now than it had been at the time. My mother's voice had been oddly composed, almost detached, as if she were discussing a minor scheduling conflict, instead of her daughter's world collapsing. "We won't be able to make it today," she had said, no hesitation, no softness. I had blinked confused. "What do you mean? The funeral is in a few hours." "Yes, we know," she replied, her tone calm, almost rehearsed. "But we have an important appointment. It's already been arranged." I remember gripping the phone tighter, a strange unease creeping in even then. What kind of appointment could be more important than this? There was a brief pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "A psychiatrist," she said finally. At the time, the word hadn't fully registered. My mind had been too overwhelmed, too consumed by loss to process anything beyond the surface of the conversation. I had simply nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and whispered, "Okay, okay." The memory of that moment made something twist painfully inside me now. How easily I had accepted it. How quickly I had let it go. Because I didn't have the strength to question it. But standing there, surrounded by people who had shown up, who had taken the time to honor the man I loved, the absence of my own parents felt louder than anything else. It wasn't just that they weren't there. It was that they had chosen not to be. A breeze passed through the open space, brushing against my face, and I realized my cheeks were wet. I hadn't even noticed when the tears started falling. They came silently, steadily, as if my body had taken over what my mind refused to fully acknowledge. Someone beside me shifted, offering a tissue. I took it automatically, dabbing at my face without really seeing the person who handed it to me. Everything felt distant, like I was underwater, the world muted and slow. The ceremony continued. Words were spoken, about love, about loss, about the kind of man he had been. I listened, or at least I tried to. Some phrases broke through the haze, settling heavily in my chest. Kenned, loyal, unforgettable. I wanted to add something. I wanted to stand up and tell them everything they didn't know, every small detail that made him who he was. But my voice felt trapped somewhere deep inside me, unreachable. Instead, I stood there in silence, alone and yet not entirely. Because even in that moment, even in the midst of grief, a faint, unfamiliar feeling began to stir beneath the surface. It was easy to ignore at first, overshadowed by everything else. But it was there, persistent and growing. A question. Why? Why today, of all days? Why that appointment at that exact time? Why did it feel less like a coincidence and more like something deliberate? I tightened my grip on the edge of the casket again, my knuckles turning white as the thought settled in more firmly. This wasn't like them. Or maybe it was, and I had just never seen it clearly before. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the ground as the sun shifts. Subtle, gradual, unavoidable. The grief was still there, overwhelming and all-consuming. But now, beneath it, something else had taken root. Something colder, something sharper. Something that didn't belong at a funeral, and yet refused to be ignored. As the final prayers were said and people began to step back, giving me space for a last goodbye, I leaned forward slightly, my breath catching in my throat. This was it. The moment I had been dreading, the moment that would make everything real in a way nothing else had. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. I wasn't ready. The words felt inadequate, painfully small compared to everything I was losing. But they were all I had. For a second, I closed my eyes, letting the weight of it all crash over me fully. And when I opened them again, something had changed. The sadness was still there. The pain hadn't lessened, but it was no longer alone. Because now, standing in the quiet aftermath of goodbye, with my parents' absence echoing louder than any words spoken that day, I felt it clearly. Not just grief, but anger. And it was only beginning. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside, like something essential had been quietly removed while I was gone. The air was still, heavy, untouched by movement or sound. For a second, I stood near the doorway without closing it, half expecting to hear his voice from another room. Some casual comment about how long I'd been out or a soft laugh at something on his phone. But there was nothing. Only silence. I slowly shut the door behind me, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. My eyes drifted instinctively to the small, familiar details that hadn't changed, as if they were waiting for him to return and give them meaning again. His shoes were still by the entrance, slightly angled the way he always left them. His jacket hung on the chair, one sleeve slipping down, as if it had been carelessly tossed there just hours ago. I moved toward it without thinking, my fingers brushing against the fabric. It was still carrying his scent, faint but unmistakable, and that was enough to make my chest tighten painfully. I closed my eyes, holding on to that small piece of him for just a moment longer than I should have. This was supposed to be the moment I broke. The moment the grief took over completely, when I collapsed onto the floor and let everything out, the tears, the pain, the unbearable weight of loss. That's what people expected. That's what I expected. But it didn't happen. Instead, something else crept in, quiet and unsettling. A thought. I pulled away from the jacket, my mind drifting back to the morning, replaying the conversation I had tried so hard to ignore. My mother's voice had been calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. My father hadn't even bothered to speak. "We have an important appointment." The words felt sharper now, stripped of the numbness that had dulled them earlier. I walked further into the house, my steps slow, my thoughts moving faster than I could keep up with. An appointment. With a psychiatrist, it didn't make sense. My parents had never believed in therapy. Growing up, any mention of mental health was met with dismissal or ridicule. If I ever showed too much emotion, they would call it weakness. If I struggled, they would tell me to be stronger. The idea of them suddenly prioritizing a psychiatric appointment, especially on a day like this, felt completely out of character, which meant it wasn't about them. I stopped in the middle of the living room, the realization settling heavily in my chest. It was about me. A chill ran through me, subtle but unmistakable. I shook my head slightly, as if trying to dislodge the thought before it could take hold. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe grief was twisting everything into something darker than it really was. But the unease didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. I walked to the kitchen, more out of habit than need. His mug was still in the sink, a faint ring of dried coffee at the bottom. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind drifting again, not to memories this time, but to questions. Why today? Why now? And why did it feel like I was missing something important? I reached for my phone, my fingers hesitating for just a second before unlocking it. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow in the dim room. No missed calls. No messages from my parents. Not even a simple check-in. That should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it felt expected. I was about to put the phone down when a notification caught my attention. A message preview, sitting quietly at the top of the screen. It was from my mother. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I noticed where it had been sent. A group chat. Not one I usually paid attention to. It was one of those family groups my mother insisted on maintaining, filled with occasional updates and meaningless conversations. I frowned slightly, tapping on it. The message was short. We'll talk to the doctor today. Once she's evaluated, we can move forward with the process. For a second, I just stared at the screen, my brain struggling to catch up with what I was reading. The words didn't make sense together. They felt disconnected, like pieces of a sentence that belonged somewhere else. Then it hit me. Evaluated, process. My stomach dropped. A slow, creeping dread spread through me, curling around my thoughts and tightening with each passing second. I read the message again, and then again, as if it might change if I looked at it long enough, but it didn't. The meaning only became clearer, and worse. This wasn't a casual conversation. This wasn't about them seeking help or addressing some personal issue. The wording was too deliberate, too calculated. This was planned, carefully. I felt my grip on the phone tighten, my fingers trembling slightly as the implications began to settle in. They weren't just concerned. They weren't just distant or uncaring. They were doing something. Something involving a doctor. Something involving an evaluation. And somehow it involved me. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier, harder to breathe. I set the phone down on the counter, but my eyes remained fixed on it, as if it might reveal more if I just waited. My mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The appointment, the timing, the message. It couldn't be a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. A conversation from months ago, one I hadn't thought much about at the time. My mother had been talking about a distant relative, someone who had gone through a difficult phase. She had mentioned doctors, evaluations, and how the family had to step in to manage things. At the time, it had felt like gossip. Now, it felt like a warning. My heart started pounding, each beat louder than the last. I picked up the phone again, scrolling through the chat, hoping desperately that there would be more context, something that would make this less terrifying. But there was nothing else. Just that one message. That one sentence. And it was enough. I backed away from the counter slowly, as if distance could somehow make it less real. My thoughts were no longer scattered. They were aligning, forming a pattern I couldn't ignore. They had skipped the funeral. Not because they didn't care, but because they were busy. Busy setting something in motion. A plan. And for the first time since the morning, the grief that had been consuming me took a step back, making room for something far colder. Fear. Not the kind that makes you panic or run, but the kind that settles deep in your bones, quiet and heavy, forcing you to pay attention. Because this wasn't just about loss anymore. This was about what came next. And whatever my parents were planning, it wasn't going to be in my favor. Sleep never came. The night stretched endlessly, thick and suffocating, each hour dragging into the next without mercy. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift with passing headlights outside, my mind refusing to quiet no matter how hard I tried. Every time I closed my eyes, the same thoughts returned, clearer, sharper, more impossible to ignore. The message, the appointment, the words evaluated, and process, echoing in a loop that wouldn't break. At some point, I gave up pretending I might rest. I pushed the blanket aside and sat up, the cold air brushing against my skin as if trying to wake me fully. The emptiness beside me was impossible to ignore. His side of the bed was undisturbed, the pillow still holding the faint imprint of where his head used to rest. For a brief second, grief surged forward again, threatening to consume everything else. But it didn't, because now it had competition. I swung my legs off the bed and stood, moving slowly through the quiet house. Every creak of the floor felt louder in the silence, every step grounding me in a reality I wasn't ready to face, but had no choice but to confront. By the time I reached the living room, my thoughts had shifted from confusion to something more focused. Suspicion. My parents had always been controlling, not in ways that were obvious to outsiders, not in ways that could easily be pointed out and labeled. It was subtler than that, a constant undercurrent of influence, shaping decisions, guiding outcomes, making me question myself just enough to rely on them. When I was younger, I thought that was normal. They decided what I wore to important events. They chose which opportunities were appropriate. For me, they had opinions about my friends, my choices, my future, and those opinions were never just suggestions. They were expectations. And I followed them. Because that's what daughters were supposed to do. It wasn't until I met him that things began to change. He didn't push. He didn't demand. He simply showed me a different way of living. A way where my thoughts mattered, where my decisions were my own, where love didn't come with conditions attached. At first, I didn't even realize how much I was changing. But my parents did. And they didn't like it. I leaned against the back of the couch, my arms folding tightly across my chest as memory after memory surfaced, no longer softened by time or denial. Every comment they had made about him, about us, about the life we were building, it all sounded different now. Are you sure he's right for you? He's influencing you too much. You've changed. At the time, I had defended him, gently but firmly. I believed they were just struggling to adjust, that their concerns came from a place of love. Now, that belief felt not RV, because it wasn't about concern, it was about control. And when they lost it, they didn't step back. They waited. The realization settled heavily in my chest as I pushed myself away from the couch and walked toward my laptop. My movements felt automatic now, driven by something deeper than emotion, instinct. I opened the laptop, the screen casting a pale glow in the dim room. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I began typing, searching for answers I wasn't sure I was ready to find. Legal processes, psychiatric evaluation, guardianship. Each result that appeared made my stomach tighten further. I clicked through pages, reading carefully, forcing myself to focus even as a growing sense of dread crept in. In certain cases, family members could request a formal psychiatric evaluation of an individual. That alone wasn't enough to do anything drastic. But it didn't stop there. If they could convince a professional that the person was mentally unstable, incapable of making sound decisions, or a danger to themselves, it could escalate. Control could be transferred. Finances, medical decisions, legal authority, everything. My breath caught as I stared at the screen, the words blurring for a moment before I forced myself to refocus. My heart was pounding now, not with panic, but with clarity. This was it. This was what they were planning. The timing made perfect sense. The pieces fit together too cleanly to ignore. My husband was gone. I was grieving, vulnerable, alone. The perfect narrative. The perfect opportunity. I pushed back from the desk slightly, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. A part of me wanted to reject it, to believe there had to be another explanation, something less calculated, but deep down, I knew better. Because this wasn't sudden, it was just the first time I was seeing it clearly. A memory surfaced, sharper than the rest. My husband's voice, calm but firm, cutting through my thoughts as if he were standing right beside me. They don't want what's best for you. I had argued with him then. Not angrily but defensively. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. They're my parents, I had said. They just worry. He had looked at me for a long moment, his expression soft but unwavering. They want what's easiest to control. At the time, I had brushed it off, unwilling to let that idea take root. Now, sitting alone in the quiet of the house we had shared, those words felt like a truth I could no longer escape. I swallowed hard, my throat tight as a wave of emotion threatened to rise again. But this time, I didn't let it take over. I couldn't afford to. Not anymore. Because this wasn't just about grief. This was about survival. I turned back to the laptop, my gaze sharpening as I read further, digging deeper into the details. What evidence would they need? How would they present it? What could they use against me? Every answer only confirmed what I already knew. They would twist my grief into instability. They would take my pain and turn it into proof. And if I wasn't careful, they would win. The thought sent a cold, steady resolve through me, pushing back against the fear that had begun to take hold. My hands steadied, my breathing slowed, and for the first time since I had read that message, my thoughts felt clear. Focused, they had made their move. Now it was my turn. I closed the laptop slowly, the soft click echoing in the silence. The house was still empty. The grief was still there, waiting just beneath the surface. But something had changed. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a target. And I refused to be easy prey. The next morning arrived without softness. There was no slow easing into daylight. No gentle transition from night to morning. It felt abrupt, like being pushed forward, before I had the chance to catch my breath. I stood in front of the mirror for a long moment, studying my reflection as if I were looking at a stranger. My eyes were swollen from a night without sleep, my face pale, my expression unreadable. I expected to see someone broken. Instead, I saw someone awake, not healed, not okay, but aware in a way I had never been before. I washed my face, tied my hair back, and chose my clothes carefully, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention. Just simple, composed, controlled. If they wanted to paint me as unstable, I wouldn't give them even the smallest brushstroke to work with. Grief could wait. This couldn't. The house still carried the same heavy silence, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a space I could think in, plan in. I moved through it with purpose now. My steps steadier than they had been the night before. The first call I made was the hardest, not because I doubted it, but because it made everything real. A lawyer. My fingers hovered over the number for a brief second before I pressed call. The ringing stretched longer than it should have, each second tightening something in my chest, but when the line finally connected, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, grounded, exactly what I needed. I explained everything. Not perfectly, not in a neat, structured way. The words came out uneven at first, tangled with emotion I was trying hard to keep under control. But as I continued, something shifted. My voice steadied. My thoughts aligned. I told her about the message, the appointment, the history, the patterns I had only just begun to recognize. She didn't interrupt. She didn't dismiss me. She listened. And when I finally stopped speaking, there was a brief pause on the line before she responded. Her tone measured but firm. You're right to be concerned. 4 simple words. But they changed everything. Because until that moment, a small part of me had still wondered if I was overreacting, if grief had distorted my thinking. Hearing someone else confirm what I already felt, that quiet fear, that growing certainty gave it weight, gave it truth. From there, things moved quickly. She explained what my parents could be attempting, how cases like this were built, what kind of evidence they might try to use. She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't soften the reality, but she also didn't make it sound inevitable. They would need proof, she said. Consistent, credible proof. And even then, it wouldn't be automatic. That was enough. Proof worked both ways. After the call ended, I didn't hesitate. I opened my laptop again, but this time, I wasn't searching blindly. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Records, messages, anything that showed the truth of who I was and who they were. I started with my phone, scrolling through conversations I hadn't thought about in months, even years. At first, it felt strange, like digging through pieces of a past I had tried to move beyond. But the more I read, the clearer everything became. The tone, the language, the subtle manipulation hidden beneath concern. You're being too emotional. You don't always make the best decisions. We're just trying to help you. At the time, those words had felt frustrating, sometimes hurtful, but not alarming. Now, they looked different. Now, they looked like a pattern. I took screenshots, saving everything carefully, methodically. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Every piece of evidence mattered. Every detail could make the difference between control and freedom. Hours passed without me noticing. The sun climbed higher, light filling the room, but I barely registered it. I was too focused, too locked into what needed to be done. Emails came next, old conversations. Subtle suggestions that I seek help during moments when I had simply disagreed with them. Instances where they had questioned my judgment, my choices, my independence. Individually, they could be dismissed. Together, they told a story. And it wasn't the one they were trying to create. By the time I finished, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, but readiness. I closed the laptop slowly, leaning back in the chair as I exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. My hands were steady now. My thoughts were clear. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. The phone rang just as I stood up. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. I answered on the second ring, my voice calm, controlled. Hello. There was a slight pause before my mother spoke, her tone softer than usual, almost careful. How are you feeling? The question hung in the air, hollow and rehearsed. I could have said a lot in that moment. I could have told her the truth, that I had buried my husband alone, that I had spent the night unraveling a plan she thought I wouldn't see. I could have confronted her directly, forced everything into the open. But I didn't. Fine, I said simply. Another pause. Then, a quiet sigh, as if she were relieved to hear exactly what she expected. We've been worried about you, she continued. This is a lot for anyone to handle. Her words were careful, deliberate. A setup. I leaned lightly against the counter, my gaze unfocused as I listened. You haven't been yourself, she added. And we think it would be a good idea for you to speak with someone. Just to make sure you're okay. There it was. Direct. Exactly what I had been waiting for. The invitation. No, the trap. I felt a faint, almost detached sense of clarity settle over me. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had anticipated. Every word, every pause, every carefully chosen phrase. They thought they were guiding me. They thought I didn't see it. I let a small smile form, though she couldn't see it. Of course, I said, my tone even, agreeable. I'd love to. The shift on the other end of the line was subtle but unmistakable. Satisfaction. Control. The quiet confidence of someone who believes everything is going according to plan. Good, she said gently. We'll arrange it? I nodded slightly, even though she couldn't see that either. I'll be there. The call ended shortly after, polite and uneventful on the surface. But as I lowered the phone, the weight of it settled in fully. This was it. The moment they had been working toward, and the moment I had been preparing for. I wasn't walking into uncertainty anymore. I knew what they were trying to do. And more importantly, I knew how to stop it. I pushed myself away from the counter and walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond. Everything outside seemed normal. Unchanged. As if nothing had shifted. But everything had. Because this time, I wasn't going in as their daughter. I wasn't going in grieving and vulnerable, searching for support that wouldn't come. I was going in aware, prepared, and ready. They had built their plan carefully. But they had made one mistake. They thought I would stay the same. They thought I would remain someone they could shape, control, and define. They were wrong. And this time, I was going to prove it. The office was quieter than I expected, almost too quiet, like the kind of place where every word carried more weight than it should. The walls were soft-colored, carefully chosen to feel calming, but the stillness pressed against me in a way that felt anything but comforting. It was controlled, measured, just like everything my parents had planned. I arrived a few minutes early. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be. I wanted to feel every second of it, to walk in fully aware of what this moment meant. The receptionist greeted me politely, her voice gentle, unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. I gave my name, sat down, and folded my hands in my lap, forcing my breathing to remain steady. Across the room, my parents were already there. Of course they were. My mother sat upright, her posture composed, her expression carefully arranged into something that looked like concern. My father was quieter, his gaze shifting briefly toward me before settling back into a distant, unreadable focus. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them said anything. For a moment, we simply existed in the same space, bound by something that no longer resembled family. I could feel it then, clearer than ever before. This wasn't about love. This was strategy. A door opened, and a voice called my name. The psychiatrist stepped into the waiting area with a calm, welcoming expression. She introduced herself briefly, her tone professional but kind, and gestured for us to follow her. I rose slowly, smoothing my sleeves, my movements deliberate, controlled. No sudden gestures. No visible tension. Nothing they could use. We entered her office together, the three of us sitting across from her. The arrangement felt intentional, me on one side, them on the other, as if the roles had already been decided before I even walked in. The psychiatrist began with simple questions, her voice soft, her manner patient. She asked about my loss, about how I had been coping, about my support system. I answered carefully, honestly but without giving more than necessary. I spoke about grief in a way that acknowledged it without letting it define me. And then, as I had expected, my parents began to speak. They didn't rush into it. They eased into their narrative, layering it slowly, carefully, like something rehearsed. My mother's voice trembled at the right moments, her concern appearing genuine to anyone who didn't know her the way I did. "She hasn't been herself," she said quietly. "Ever since everything happened." My father nodded in agreement, his silence acting as confirmation. "She's been distant." My mother continued. "Emotional, sometimes irrational. We're just worried she's not thinking clearly." Each word was placed with precision, not too extreme, not too mild, just enough to suggest instability without sounding accusatory. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression neutral. On the surface, I looked exactly like what they wanted me to be, quiet, subdued, possibly overwhelmed. But inside I was watching. Waiting. The psychiatrist nodded thoughtfully, occasionally asking them to elaborate, to give examples. And they did. Carefully selected moments, framed in a way that suited their story. Disagreements turned into episodes. Independence reframed as resistance. It was subtle, convincing, and completely false. Finally, the psychiatrist turned to me. "Would you like to share your perspective?" The room shifted slightly in that moment, the balance tilting in a way my parents hadn't anticipated. I could feel it in the way my mother's posture stiffened, in the brief flicker of uncertainty that crossed her face. This was the moment they thought I would falter. The grieving widow, the overwhelmed daughter, the easy narrative. I met the psychiatrist's gaze, steady and clear. "Yes," I said. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. I started simply, calmly. I spoke about my husband, about the loss, about the natural weight of grief. I didn't deny it. I didn't try to appear unaffected. That would have been unrealistic. Instead, I acknowledged it. And then I shifted. I spoke about the message, not emotionally, not dramatically, factually. I explained the timing, the wording, the implications. I described my parents' history, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Patterns of control, subtle manipulation, their resistance to my independence, especially after my marriage. The psychiatrist listened closely, her attention sharpening with each detail. I continued, carefully introducing the evidence I had gathered. The messages, the language, the repeated attempts to question my judgment over time. I didn't overwhelm the conversation, I guided it. Each point connected. Each detail reinforced the last. By the time I finished, the room felt different. The narrative had shifted. My parents' confidence didn't shatter all at once. It cracked. Small fractures forming beneath the surface, as they realized this wasn't unfolding the way they had planned. My mother tried to recover first. "That's not what we meant," she said quickly, her voice losing some of its earlier softness. "She's misinterpreting?" "I'm not," I replied, still calm, still steady. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth had already taken its place in the room. The psychiatrist's expression had changed. The warmth was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else. Discernment. She asked more questions then, but they were different. More precise, directed not just at me, but at my parents. Clarifying inconsistencies, highlighting gaps. Gently but firmly, pulling at the threads they had tried so carefully to weave together. And one by one, those threads began to unravel. Their answers grew less certain. Their tone less controlled. The balance they had maintained at the start slipped further with each passing minute. Because they hadn't prepared for resistance. They hadn't prepared for me. By the time the session came to an end, the outcome wasn't announced outright. It didn't need to be. It was written in the shift of posture, in the quiet understanding that settled over the room. Their plan had failed. Not quietly, not subtly, but completely. We stood to leave, the air heavier now, filled with something unspoken but undeniable. My parents didn't look at me as we walked out. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. For the first time, they didn't have control. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Or maybe it was just me. I paused for a moment before stepping away from the building, letting the reality of what had just happened settle in. The grief was still there. It hadn't disappeared, it hadn't lessened. But it was no longer the only thing I felt. There was something else now. Something steady. Something unshakable. Power. Not loud. Not aggressive. Quiet. Certain, I walked to my car slowly, each step grounding me further in that feeling. For so long, I had defined myself through them. Through their expectations, their approval, their version of who I was supposed to be. But that version didn't exist anymore. Maybe it never had. Because standing there, in the aftermath of everything, loss, betrayal, confrontation, I didn't feel like their daughter. I felt like someone new. Someone they couldn't shape. Someone they couldn't reach. That night, when I returned home, the silence was still there. The emptiness hadn't changed. His absence was still a wound that would take time to understand, let alone heal. But I wasn't standing in that silence the same way anymore. I wasn't lost inside it, I existed within it. And that made all the difference. I sat down slowly, my hands resting in my lap as I looked around the space we had once shared. The memories were still there. The love was still there. And so was I. Not broken. Not defeated. Still standing. I had lost him. I had faced them. And in the space between those two things, I had found something I didn't even realize I had been missing. Myself.